She betrayed me, the Duke swore, but when he saw the child's eyes in her arms, his world fell silent. The drawing room of Ashton Hall lay bathed in the amber glow of gaslight, yet shadows pooled in every corner like spilled ink. Elowen Hartley stood motionless near the window, her gloved fingers pressed against the cold pane, watching the carriage wheels fade into the mist beyond the iron gates. Behind her, the silence of the house pressed down with such weight that even her breath seemed a transgression. She had known, of course, that this moment would arrive. Lady Marwyn's whispers had grown too loud to ignore, spreading through the drawing rooms of London like smoke through an open door. Whispers about the child, whispers about her, each murmur another thread in the noose that society had woven with such meticulous care. The sound came without warning. Boots on marble, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the entrance hall. Elowen's spine straightened. She did not turn. She could hear his breathing before she saw him, that deep, measured intake of a man fighting to contain a tempest. "You may leave us," came the voice, low, deliberate, carrying the weight of absolute authority. The servants scattered like startled birds. The door crashed shut. Elowen turned at last, and there stood Ronan Valahurst, Duke of Ashton, his silhouette framed in the doorway like a monument carved from shadow and fury. His coat was still damp from the journey. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, fell untamed across his brow. But it was his eyes, those terrible, brilliant green eyes that held all of her attention. They burned with the fire of a man betrayed. "Where is it?" His voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. "Your Grace." She inclined her head with measured grace, though her hands had begun to tremble. "I did not expect your return from the country estate. Where is the child?" The words were not a question. They were a verdict handed down from on high, and the weight of them fell upon her shoulders like stones. Elowen lifted her chin. She had prepared for this confrontation for weeks now, rehearsing her composure in the mirror, steeling herself for the moment when his righteous anger would seek its outlet. Yet no amount of preparation could have fortified her against the sheer magnitude of his presence, the raw, primal force of a man of his stature and station. "Upstairs," she said quietly, "in the nursery, sleeping." His laugh was a terrible thing, devoid of warmth, hollowed by accusation. He moved toward her with the gait of a predator, each step a drumbeat of judgment. "So you do not deny its existence? At least you possess the minimum courtesy of honesty, though it comes far too late for that virtue to save you." "Your Grace, I—" "Silence." His hand rose, and she fell mute, though the word itself felt like a physical blow. "I have ridden through the night, Miss Hartley, through mist and cold that would have turned a lesser man back to the comfort of his hearth. Do you know why?" She did not answer. She did not dare. "Because I heard in the most respectable quarters that you whom I took under my protection, whom I believed to possess even a thread of honor, had borne a child. A bastard," they whispered. "My bastard," some dared suggest, though that calumny falls so far beneath my dignity that I scarcely credit those who uttered it. He paused, and in that terrible silence she heard the full measure of his rage. "Tell me, Miss Hartley. Tell me whose child it is, and perhaps, I shall not see you cast out into the street before the sun rises." Elowen's breath came shallow. She had rehearsed many responses to this moment, but now that it had arrived, each prepared phrase crumbled to ash upon her tongue. The injustice of it, the terrible, suffocating weight of being accused of a sin she had not committed, nearly broke her composure. Yet she held firm. She held to the truth, though the truth itself seemed a fragile thing against the force of his conviction. "I cannot tell you what you wish to hear," she said at last, her voice steady despite the chaos within her breast, "because the truth is not mine alone to reveal." "Then whose truth is it?" His voice dropped to something more dangerous than rage, to something cold and crystalline and absolute. "Whose deception am I protecting by my silence? For that is what you demand, is it not? That I stand silent whilst you dismantle the honor of this house?" She did not answer, could not. The words that lived in her heart were too dangerous, too tender, too fraught with consequences that neither of them was prepared to face. He stood before her, this magnificent and terrible man, waiting for her confession. His hand moved instinctively to the pocket where he kept his timepiece, an old habit when rage threatened to overwhelm reason. That watch had ceased to keep time years before, frozen at the hour of a loss too profound to name. Now it served only as a talisman of his own internal desolation. "Very well," he said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more lethal than any shout. "You have made your choice. Tomorrow you shall be gone from this house. The child, your precious secret, shall be removed to whatever charity or workhouse accepts such circumstances. And you, Miss Hartley, shall learn what it means to betray the trust of a man who gave you everything." He turned toward the door, his cape sweeping behind him like the wings of some great dark bird. Elowen found her voice at last. "Your Grace, I beg you, before you condemn what you do not understand—" "I understand perfectly," he said without turning. "I understand that you have deceived me, and that is all that matters." The door closed behind him with a sound like the final page of a book snapping shut. Morning crept into Ashton Hall like an unwelcome guest, grey and reluctant, casting no light but only deepening the shadows that seemed to have taken residence in every corner since the Duke's terrible pronouncement. Elowen had not slept. How could she? Every moment of the endless night had been consumed with the labour of deciding. Should she flee? Should she fight? Should she tell him the truth and risk the consequences, or maintain her silence and let him believe the worst? The nursery was quiet when she ascended the stairs. The child slept as children do, with that absolute trust in the world that only the innocent possess. Elowen stood over the small cradle, her fingers brushing ever so gently against the soft hair that caught the pale morning light. Those eyes, when they opened, they would be the colour of spring rain mixed with amber. They would betray everything. They would confirm what she had kept hidden for so long. "You must see him," came a voice from the doorway. Elowen spun, her heart leaping into her throat. It was not the Duke. It was Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper, who had served Ashton Hall for more decades than anyone could count. Her face was grave, creased with concern, and in her weathered hands she held a letter, sealed with wax the colour of old wine. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elowen whispered urgently, "you must not have come. If His Grace discovers—" "His Grace is in his study, drowning his fury in brandy and poor decisions," the old woman replied with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen too much to be easily cowed. "I have served in this house long enough to know when a man is about to commit a grave injustice. This letter came by messenger 3 days past, marked for your eyes alone. I have held it, knowing, child, that it would be needed. The Duke must read this before he destroys what remains of his own heart." Elowen took the letter with trembling hands. The seal bore a familiar crest, one she recognized, one that explained everything and nothing simultaneously. "Who brought it?" she asked. "A woman, wrapped in dark cloth, speaking barely above a whisper. She said only that the truth had been delayed too long already, and that honor, real honor, not the brittle pride of men, demanded revelation." Biscay. Whitmore's eyes were kind, infinitely understanding. "She said you would know whom it came from. She said you would understand why it had been kept secret." Elowen's hands shook as she held the letter. The wax bore the seal of the Valahurst family, not the Duke's personal insignia, but something older, something connected to the great houses of England. Her mind raced through possibilities, through connections she had never dared to fully articulate even to herself. "I cannot," Elowen whispered. "I cannot give him this. It will only tell him the truth," Mrs. Whitmore said firmly. "And a man, no matter how proud, deserves truth before he condemns the innocent." A sound from downstairs, a door slamming, heavy footfalls, made them both freeze. The old housekeeper pressed the letter into Elowen's palm with surprising strength and withdrew, closing the nursery door quietly behind her. Elowen stood alone with the sleeping child, the unopened letter burning in her hands like a coal pulled from a dying fire. She could feel, in that moment, the full weight of the silence she had maintained, the silence that had seemed noble, protective, necessary. But perhaps, she thought with a sudden clarity that felt almost like grief, perhaps silence was only another form of deception. The child stirred, tiny fingers curling in sleep. Elowen bent and pressed a kiss to that small forehead, breathing in the scent of lavender water and innocence. Whatever came next, whatever truths needed to be spoken, this small creature would be safe. She would ensure it. Downstairs, she could hear the Duke moving through the halls. His movements were chaotic, furious, the movements of a man at war with himself. He had ordered the carriage prepared. He was making arrangements for her removal, just as he had promised. The machinery of his authority was grinding forward, indifferent to questions of justice or mercy. Elowen descended the stairs slowly, the letter held against her heart like a shield. The drawing-room door was open. She could see him pacing before the fireplace, his coat discarded, his cravat loosened, his broad shoulders tense beneath the linen of his shirt. When he sensed her presence, he turned, and the look in his eyes was something between fury and despair. "Have you come to beg?" he asked coldly. "To plead for mercy? I warn you, Miss Hartley, your tears shall move me no more than your deceptions have." "I have come," she said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her, "to tell you something you must hear whether you wish to hear it or not. But first you must read this." She extended the letter toward him, her hand steady despite the tumult in her breast. He looked at it as though it were a serpent. "I have no interest in—" "Please," she said, and the word contained all of the desperation and grace she could summon. "I have asked nothing of you, Your Grace, but I ask this now. Read it. Then, if you still wish me gone, I shall leave without another word of protest." Something in her voice, or perhaps something in the memory of what had once passed between them, however briefly, made him pause. He reached out slowly, almost reluctantly, and took the letter from her hand. She could see his fingers tremble slightly as he broke the seal. As he read, she watched his face. She watched the fury drain from his features, replaced by something more complex. Shock, realization, and underneath it all, a dawning comprehension of the magnitude of his own error. The letter fell from the Duke's fingers like a leaf released from a branch. His face, that handsome, terrible face that had haunted Elowen's dreams for months, had gone white, drained of all color and certainty. He sank into the leather chair beside the fireplace, as though his knees had suddenly forgotten their purpose. "This is impossible," he whispered, though his eyes had already traced every word twice, 3 times, seeking some error in the script that would render the contents a lie. "This is a forgery, a trick orchestrated by—" "It is neither," Elowen said quietly, moving to the window so that she might not see the devastation written across his features. To witness it would be to feel it, and she could not afford such luxury. Not yet. Not whilst the future remained unwritten. "It is the truth that has been kept from you by those who loved you too much to bear your grief." He was on his feet now, pacing like a caged animal, the letter clenched in his fist. "My sister. All this time, my sister knew, and she said nothing?" "She was protecting you," Elowen said. "The child was born in grief, Your Grace. Your sister believed that to tell you would only compound a loss that was already unbearable." "A loss," he laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You speak of loss as though it were a matter of sentiment, as though— He could not finish. His hand moved instinctively to his waistcoat pocket, to the watch that had ceased to mark time years before. That old habit of seeking something solid when the world shifted beneath his feet. "She was with child when the fever took her," Elowen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The last letter she sent to your sister before she died begged that you be told the truth only when you could bear it. She begged that her child be cared for, protected, loved, not because of what had been, but because of what should be. A new beginning, she called it, a redemption that neither of you could have foreseen. And you?" The word came like a whip crack. "What role did you play in this deception, Miss Hartley? Why was I left to believe, to think that you had—" He could not complete the sentence. The very thought seemed to choke him. "Your sister came to me 6 months ago," Elowen said, finally turning to face him. "She came to ask if I would serve as the child's guardian, if I would raise him here in your household, under the guise of a foundling entrusted to my care. She believed that in time, when the initial shock had faded, she could tell you the truth. She believed that you would wish to know him. She believed wrong." But even as he said it, the conviction had drained from his voice. He moved to the window, pressing his palm against the glass as though trying to reach through it to some other world where this conversation was not happening. "Did she?" Elowen asked gently. "Then why do you spend hours in the nursery when you believe no one is watching? Why did you leave a wooden horse carved with your own hands beside his cradle? Why does your voice soften when you speak of him, even in anger?" He turned to her, and she saw it then, the moment when fury transformed into something far more terrible and far more true. Tears stood in those green eyes, unshed but imminent, like rain that refuses to fall. "How you should have told me," he said, and the words were barely audible. "Regardless of what was decided, regardless of the pain, you should have told me." "Yes," Elowen agreed. "I should have. I was a coward, Your Grace. I told myself I was protecting you, but the truth is far more shameful. I was protecting myself. I was afraid of your rage, and I was afraid—" She paused, and her voice trembled. "I was afraid of the loss of your good opinion." He stared at her, as though truly seeing her for the first time, not as a deception, not as an enemy, but as a woman who had borne an impossible weight in silence. "What is his name?" the Duke asked finally, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Alden," Elowen replied. Your sister chose it before he was born. It means old friend, wise counsel. She wanted him to carry a name that spoke to continuity, to healing, to the bonds that outlast tragedy. The Duke closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of his certainty. "I must see him," he said. "Yes," Elowen whispered. "You must." Together, in a silence that was no longer accusation but something far more complex, they ascended the stairs toward the nursery. Each step was a journey through the landscape of everything he had believed and everything that was now being revealed. When he stood at last in the doorway and looked upon the child sleeping in the cradle, that small, perfect creature with the amber-green eyes that mirrored his own, the Duke's breath caught. He reached out one massive hand, and Elowen saw it tremble as his fingers brushed the child's dark hair. "Alden," he whispered, and in that single word was contained all the sorrow and longing and desperate love of a man learning to reclaim a part of himself he had thought forever lost. The world in that moment fell silent. The morning light filtered through the nursery windows in pale golden streams, and Ronan Valahurst remained motionless in the chair beside Alden's cradle, as though movement itself might shatter the fragile understanding that had begun to take root in his heart during the long hours of the night. He had not slept. How could he? Every moment that had passed since he had read that letter was a moment of reckoning, a moment in which the architecture of his certainty had crumbled into dust. His fingers, calloused and strong from years of managing his vast estates, rested upon the wooden edge of the cradle with surprising gentleness. He traced the grain of the wood, oak, carved by his own hands months ago, in a moment of what he had attributed to idle distraction. Now he understood. Some part of him, deeper than thought, deeper than pride, had known all along. Elowen stood in the doorway, watching him. She had not slept either. He could see it in the slight shadows beneath her eyes, in the way her posture carried the weight of exhaustion. Yet she did not move to withdraw. There was a courage in her stillness that he was only beginning to comprehend. "Your sister," he said at last, his voice rough from disuse, "did she believe that I would cast out an innocent child?" "Your sister believed that you would grieve first," Elowen replied carefully, stepping into the room but not approaching too near. "She believed that you would need time to understand. She believed that a man of your intensity required space to process sorrow before he could open his heart to joy." He turned to look at her, and she saw the rawness of emotion barely contained beneath the surface of his features. "And what did you believe, Miss Hartley?" The question hung between them like a blade suspended in air, waiting only for the breath that would determine its fall. "I believed," Elowen said slowly, choosing each word as though constructing a bridge across an abyss, "that you were a man capable of great cruelty and great tenderness in equal measure. I believed that you would need the truth, even though it would cause you pain, and I believed—" She paused, and her voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. "I believed that keeping the truth from you was a greater betrayal than any deception." Ronan rose from the chair, and she braced herself for his anger, for the return of the fury that had driven him to this house mere hours ago. But when he spoke, it was not with rage, but with something far more dangerous, with the careful control of a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. "You were right," he said, "and that is perhaps the most intolerable truth of all." He moved toward the window, his broad frame blocking much of the light, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of long-buried grief. "My wife, her name was Catherine. She was kind, gentle, possessed of a beauty that seemed almost ethereal. We were married by contract, as is the way of our class, but I came to love her, not with the tempestuous passion that poets write of, but with a deep and abiding affection." Elowen remained silent, understanding that he needed to speak, to give voice to the sorrow that had festered in silence for far too long. "She was with child when the fever came," he continued. "A simple illness, the physician said, nothing that warranted concern. But fever, in its capricious way, cares nothing for assurances or prayers. She died within a fortnight. The child died with her, or so I was told. I never questioned it. I had no reason to. My sister came to me, and she said that the loss was complete, and I—" He broke off, his hand moving to his waistcoat pocket, to that old watch that had ceased to mark time in the moment of his wife's death. "You retreated," Elowen said softly. "I retreated into anger," he corrected. "Into the conviction that the world was a place of casual cruelties, where love was merely a prelude to suffering, where trust was rewarded with betrayal. I made myself a fortress, Miss Hartley, impenetrable, solitary, and in doing so, I have missed—" He turned back to look at the sleeping child. "I have missed months of my own son's life." The word hung in the air like a bell struck in a cathedral. Son, not the child, not the foundling, his son. "It is not too late," Elowen said, and in those words was contained all of her hope, all of her desperate belief in redemption. "Is it not?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time as something more than an accomplice to deception. "You have cared for him. You have loved him. What right do I have to claim what I have abandoned?" "Every right," Elowen replied, stepping forward with quiet conviction. "Fatherhood is not a claim of possession, Your Grace. It is a claim of responsibility, of love, of the willingness to put the needs of another before one's own comfort. If that is what you wish to offer, then you have more than a right. You have a duty." He was silent for a long moment, and then, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their care, he returned to the cradle. He reached down with both hands, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a man of his size and strength, he lifted the sleeping child against his chest. Alden stirred but did not wake, nestling instinctively into the warmth of his father's embrace. Ronan's face as he looked down upon the boy transformed utterly. The hardness that had defined him for so long seemed to melt away, replaced by an expression of such profound tenderness that Elowen felt her breath catch in her throat. "Alden," he whispered, and it was a prayer, a vow, a redemption spoken in a single name. "My son, my precious, innocent son." And in that moment, watching a man of steel and pride learn to unbend before the weight of love, Elowen understood that the true betrayal would have been to keep this reunion from happening. The afternoon brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of Ashton Hall, as though the very walls had begun to acknowledge the transformation occurring within them. Ronan had not released Alden from his arms for more than a few moments at a time, and even then, his eyes followed the child's movements with an intensity that spoke of a man attempting to compress months of fatherhood into a single day. It was near the hour of tea when he finally sought Elowen out in the library, where she had retreated to give him private moments with his son. She was seated near the tall windows, a book resting unopened in her lap, her gaze distant and melancholic. When he entered, she rose with the automatic grace of one trained in propriety, yet her eyes betrayed her. They held a wariness born of uncertainty about what came next. "You have not eaten," he said, and it was not a question, but an observation made with a note of concern that surprised them both. "I am not particularly hungry," she replied quietly. He moved toward her, and she had to resist the impulse to retreat. The man who had condemned her so thoroughly mere hours ago now carried about him an air of something approaching humility, though it sat uneasily upon his broad shoulders, as though dignity itself was a garment he was learning to wear anew. "Elowen," he said, and the use of her given name, stripped of all title, struck her like a physical blow. "I owe you an apology that words cannot possibly contain. I have spent the afternoon with my son, and with every moment I have come to understand the magnitude of what you have sacrificed." "I have sacrificed nothing," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I have cared for a child. That is not sacrifice. That is privilege. You have done far more than that." He moved to the window, and the afternoon light caught the sharp lines of his profile. "You have maintained his care whilst bearing the weight of false accusation. You have endured my contempt and my rage without defending yourself. You have protected his identity and his future, even at the cost of your own reputation and safety. That is not privilege, Elowen. That is an act of love so profound that it humbles me entirely." She turned away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. "Your Grace." "Ronan," he interrupted gently. "My name is Ronan. I would hear you speak it, if you could bring yourself to do so." The request felt like a crossing of some sacred threshold, and Elowen found herself struggling to steady her breathing. "It would not be proper, sir. The world would not understand." "The world be damned," he said, though without heat. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the absolute conviction of a man accustomed to authority. "I care nothing for what the world understands or fails to understand. What I care for is truth, and the truth is that you have been the only honest thing in my life for longer than I am willing to admit." She turned to face him then, and what she saw in his expression was a vulnerability that seemed entirely incongruous with his massive frame and commanding presence. "You are grateful," she said carefully. "You are grateful for what I have done, and gratitude has softened your anger. But that is not— It is not gratitude," he said, moving closer to her with measured steps. "Or rather, it is gratitude, yes, but gratitude is not the whole of what I feel. What I feel—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed insufficient to the magnitude of his emotion. What I feel is something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Elowen's heart quickened. She understood what he was approaching, and every lesson in propriety, every convention of their society, screamed at her to stop him from speaking what could not be unsaid. "Please do not," she whispered. "Why?" He reached out and took her hand, and despite every objection her rational mind raised, she did not pull away. "Why should I not speak the truth that has been burning in my breast since the moment I truly looked upon you?" "Because I am nothing," she said, and the words came from some deep well of self-protection within her. "I am the daughter of a disgraced academic, raised without fortune or connection. I am a woman of uncertain position, neither servant nor lady, neither wife nor widow. I am a scandal waiting to happen." "You are," he said quietly, his thumb tracing gentle circles upon the back of her hand, "the bravest woman I have ever encountered. You are intelligent, you are kind, you are possessed of a moral courage that shames my own cowardice. You are everything that I have pretended not to see, and everything that I cannot now unsee." "This is infatuation born of emotion," Elowen said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It is the gratitude you spoke of, dressed in the language of deeper feeling." "Then why," he asked, "did I spend months carving wooden toys for a child I did not believe was my own? Why did I find myself arranging my schedule so that I might pass the nursery at the hour when he was most often awake? Why did I stand outside your window on cold nights, watching your shadow move across the curtains, and feel such longing that I could barely breathe?" Elowen's eyes filled with tears. "You cannot speak such things. If anyone were to hear, then we shall speak them only in private," he said. "But we shall speak them, Elowen, because silence has already cost us too much, and I will not spend another day pretending that what I feel is anything other than the deepest love." He raised her hand to his lips, and the contact, that gentle, reverent touch, seemed to brand her very soul. In that moment, despite all the conventions that stood arrayed against them, despite all the obstacles that society would place in their path, Elowen allowed herself to believe that redemption might be possible. Evening descended upon Ashton Hall like a benediction, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose that seemed to mirror the emotional turmoil churning within Elowen's breast. She stood in the nursery watching as Ronan read to Alden a children's tale about brave knights and distant kingdoms, his deep voice rising and falling with theatrical flourish that made the child giggle with pure, uncomplicated joy. The sight of them together was almost too much to bear. Father and son, learning each other, bridging months of separation in the span of mere hours. Yet underneath her joy ran a current of profound apprehension. What had transpired between Ronan and herself in the library had changed something fundamental, had shifted the ground beneath their feet into new and unmapped territory. As if sensing her thoughts, Ronan looked up from the book and met her gaze across the lamp-lit room. Something passed between them in that moment. An acknowledgement, a promise, a question neither was quite ready to answer. "The child grows drowsy," he murmured, though his eyes never left hers. "Perhaps we should allow him rest." Elowen moved forward, and together they settled Alden into his cradle. The boy's eyes were already closing, his small fist wrapped around a wooden carving, one of the toys Ronan had crafted, clutching it even in sleep. "He loves you already," Elowen observed softly. "He does not understand that you have only recently entered his life. To him, you have always been here. Children possess a wisdom that we adults have spent years learning to suppress," Ronan replied. He reached out and gently adjusted the coverlet around the sleeping boy, a gesture of such tenderness that Elowen felt her resolve wavering. "They recognize love when they encounter it, uncomplicated by the doubts and fears that plague us." They withdrew from the nursery and descended the stairs in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down upon them both. It was Ronan who finally broke the quiet as they reached the entrance hall. "There is much that remains to be addressed," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man considering a problem of considerable import. "My sister must be made to understand that secrecy, no matter how well-intentioned, has caused far greater harm than transparency ever could. Lady Marwyn's whispers must be countered with truth. And your position in this house—" He paused, turning to face her fully. "Your position must be formalized, protected, made unassailable against the gossip that will inevitably follow." "What are you suggesting?" Elowen asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I am suggesting," he said carefully, that you have earned a place here that goes far beyond your role as the child's guardian. I am suggesting that you deserve recognition, security, and the absolute protection of this title and this house. I am suggesting—" He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew something small and glimmering. "I am suggesting that you permit me to offer you my name." It was a ring, not ostentatious, but finely wrought, bearing a stone of deep amber set in white gold. It was, Eowyn thought dazedly, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Your Grace, Ronan, you cannot mean—" "I have never meant anything more completely in my entire life," he said, and when he took her hand, his touch was steady, certain, carrying with it the weight of absolute conviction. "I know that the world will whisper. I know that some will question my judgment, that others will presume base motives, but let them whisper. I care not for the opinions of those who lack the courage to love as I have come to love you." "I am afraid," Eowyn whispered. "Of what?" "Of awakening tomorrow and finding that this has been merely a dream, born of emotion and relief, of discovering that what you feel is obligation masquerading as affection, of being responsible for the destruction of your reputation alongside my own." She paused and her voice broke slightly. "Of loving you so completely that I have no self left to protect." He drew her close, and she found herself pressed against the broad expanse of his chest, her ear over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm of it beneath layers of fine wool and linen. "I will not give you false assurances," he said quietly. "The world will judge us harshly. There will be whispers and condemnation, but I swear to you, Eowyn, by every part of myself that has been remade by the events of these past hours, that what I feel is real, and it will not diminish. If anything, it will deepen with each passing day." He pulled back slightly and lifted her chin so that she was forced to meet his gaze. "Will you marry me?" The words hung in the air, simple and profound, carrying within them the power to reshape everything. Eowyn thought of society's expectations, of propriety, of all the carefully constructed rules that governed the world she inhabited. And then she thought of Alden, sleeping peacefully in the nursery above, secure in the knowledge of belonging. She thought of the love that had manifested itself in quiet acts of devotion, in wooden toys crafted with patient hands, in a man who had learned to bend his pride before the needs of those he held dear. "Yes," she said, and the word was barely more than a breath. "Yes, I will marry you." When he kissed her, gentle, reverent, asking rather than demanding, Eowyn felt the final chains of her old life fall away, leaving her free to step into a future that only hours ago would have seemed impossible. 3 weeks had passed since Ronan had placed the amber ring upon Eowyn's finger, and in that interval, the machinery of society had begun its inexorable churn. The news of their engagement had spread through London's drawing rooms with the velocity of wildfire through dry bracken, and with it had come a cacophony of responses ranging from cautious approval to outright scandal. Ronan stood in his study, looking out across the gardens of Ashton Hall, where autumn had begun its slow transformation of the landscape. His correspondence lay in neat stacks upon his desk, letters from colleagues offering congratulations tinged with barely concealed skepticism, notes from family members ranging from his sister's effusive joy to more distant relatives' thinly veiled disapproval. The knock upon the door was sharp, decisive, unmistakably that of a woman accustomed to having her presence acknowledged immediately. Lady Marwyn Crestfell entered without awaiting permission, her austere frame draped in grey silk that seemed almost to repel the light rather than reflect it. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, swept across the room with the assessing gaze of one cataloguing evidence for judgment. "Your Grace," she said, her tone carrying all the warmth of a winter frost, "I trust you will forgive the intrusion. Certain matters have reached such a pitch of impropriety that I felt compelled to address them personally." "Lady Marwyn," Ronan replied, gesturing toward a chair with studied courtesy, "your concern for propriety does you credit, though I confess I am uncertain what particular impropriety has drawn you here." "Your engagement to Miss Hartley," she said, settling herself with the rigidity of a woman who refuses to relax even in the privacy of another's home. "Surely you understand the implications of such a union. A woman of uncertain provenance, of questionable character, elevated to the position of Duchess? The scandal will reverberate for years." Ronan's expression remained serene, though his hand tightened almost imperceptibly upon the arm of his chair. "I fail to see any uncertainty in Miss Hartley's character, Lady Marwyn. She is the daughter of a respected scholar, educated, accomplished, and possessed of moral fibre that puts to shame many of those who presume to judge her." "And the child?" Lady Marwyn's voice dropped to an insinuating whisper. Surely you do not expect the Tun to believe that she is merely a guardian to some foundling. The resemblance, the child is my son, Ronan said flatly. He is the son of my late wife, born after my presumed knowledge of his existence. Miss Hartley has served as his guardian with exemplary devotion, and for that service, she deserves gratitude and protection, not condemnation. The revelation hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in all directions. Lady Marwyn's face underwent a subtle transformation, not quite shock, but certainly something that approximated reassessment. I see, she said finally. Then the child is legitimate? Entirely, Ronan confirmed. As is my intention to marry Miss Hartley and present her to society as my wife, my equal, and the mother to my son. Should the Tun choose to judge her for her modest origins or the circumstances of her entry into my household, that judgment will reflect far more upon them than upon her. Lady Marwyn rose, her visit apparently concluded. You are playing a dangerous game, Your Grace. Society does not take kindly to being defied. Then it is fortunate, Ronan replied, rising as well, that I care nothing for the opinions of those too small-minded to recognize genuine virtue when it stands before them. After Lady Marwyn had departed, Ronan remained standing before the window for a long while, his thoughts occupied with the growing complexity of the path he had chosen. Elowen had understood, when he had spoken of marriage, that it would not be easy. But understanding in abstract and experiencing in reality were vastly different propositions. He found her in the morning room, seated at a small desk where she was engaged in correspondence of her own. At his entrance she looked up, and he saw the evidence of recent tears upon her cheeks. Lady Marwyn paid a call upon me this morning as well, Elowen said quietly. She came to inform me with great delicacy that my marriage to you would be a grave mistake, both for your reputation and for my own. She suggested that I might reconsider, that perhaps a more modest arrangement might be more suitable. Ronan moved to her and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his own. Did you tell her where she might direct such suggestions? Despite her distress, a small smile played at the corners of Elowen's mouth. I was far more diplomatic, though I confess I felt the weight of her disapproval keenly. The world will adjust, he said, and there was such certainty in his voice that she found herself believing it might be true. Society is far more malleable than it pretends. One scandalous duchess is quickly forgotten when that duchess proves herself capable, intelligent, and devoted to her duties. We shall give them no cause for continued censure, and within a season, something else will capture their fickle attention. And if you are wrong? Elowen asked, though she did not withdraw her hands from his. Then we shall face it together, he replied, raising her fingers to his lips, which is all that truly matters. The grand ballroom of Ashton House in Mayfair had been transformed for the occasion of the betrothal celebration. Crystal chandeliers cast their benevolent glow upon the assembled guests, a careful selection of family, trusted allies, and those prominent enough that their attendance would lend legitimacy to the union, yet not so hostile as to create outright rebellion. Elowen stood in a small antechamber, adjusting the pearl combs in her hair, her reflection in the mirror a study in controlled apprehension. Her gown was exquisite, a creation of ivory silk with delicate beadwork that caught the light like captured starshine, but it felt almost like armor, a protective shell against the gazes she would face. A soft knock announced Ronan's arrival. He had not seen her dress, adhering to the old tradition that the groom should be spared the anticipation, and when he entered and beheld her fully, she saw something shift in his expression, a deepening of the intensity that had come to characterize his regard for her. You are breathtaking, he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice steadied her racing heart. I am terrified, she replied, with equal honesty. He moved to her and took both her hands, his large fingers gentle against her own. So am I, he admitted, but we shall face this together. I will stand beside you, and when the whispers begin, and they will, we shall answer with quiet dignity. We shall show them that love, genuine and true, is worth far more than the approval of those whose hearts are shriveled by cynicism and fear. The orchestra began to play as they made their way toward the ballroom entrance. Ronan placed her hand upon his arm, and she felt the tension in his muscles. He was not as calm as his words suggested, and that small acknowledgement of his own vulnerability made her own fear seem somehow more bearable. The moment they stepped into the ballroom, the music faltered. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them, and for a suspended moment, there was silence. Elowen felt her breath catch, felt the weight of judgment and speculation pressing down upon her from all sides. Then Ronan raised his free hand, and the gesture commanded such absolute authority that the orchestra resumed. The dancers returned to their movements, and the moment of uncertainty passed. He guided her to the center of the floor, and without preamble, without waiting for the orchestration of ceremony or protocol, he took her into his arms and began to dance. It was a waltz, that most intimate of dances, and every eye in the ballroom followed their movements. "What are you doing?" Elowen whispered, though she matched his steps perfectly as though they had waltzed together 1,000 times. "I am showing them," he replied, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "that I am proud to stand beside you. I am showing them that you are not some shameful secret to be hidden, but a woman worthy of honor." As they moved through the intricate patterns of the dance, Elowen became aware of a shift in the atmosphere. The initial disapproval was being replaced by something else, curiosity perhaps, or the beginning of acceptance. When the waltz concluded, and Ronan raised her hand to his lips in a gesture of public devotion, she heard the first tentative applause begin to ripple through the assembly. It was Lady Ashton, his sister, who broke through the remaining ice. She rose from her seat and clapped enthusiastically, her expression radiating such obvious joy that others felt compelled to follow her lead. Within moments, the applause had swelled to something approaching genuine warmth. Later, as the evening progressed and Elowen found herself engaged in conversations with ladies who had previously cut her in the street, she understood what Ronan had accomplished. He had not asked society for acceptance. He had simply claimed her so completely, so publicly, so without apology, that acceptance became the only reasonable response. When she found him near the refreshment tables, she drew him aside to a quiet alcove. "You are remarkable," she said. "Do you know that?" "I am merely a man in love," he replied, drawing her slightly closer. "Propriety be damned. A man who will not see his beloved diminished by the pettiness of others." "And if the whispers do not cease?" Elowen asked. "Then we shall give them time to find other scandals," he said. "And in the meantime, we shall build a life so filled with purpose and devotion that their whispers will seem like the buzzing of insignificant insects." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew his old watch, the one that had ceased to mark time in the moment of his wife's death. "I had this repaired," he said, pressing it into her hand. "I had it set to begin marking time again, beginning on the day you said you would marry me. Time moves forward, Elowen, and we shall move with it, together, unafraid." Winter had arrived at Ashton Hall with an early snow that transformed the gardens into something resembling an enchanted realm. Elowen stood at the nursery window, watching as Ronan moved across the white expanse, with Alden held securely in his arms, the child shrieking with delight at the cold flakes landing upon his small nose. In the weeks since the betrothal celebration, life at the estate had undergone a fundamental transformation. The servants, quick to read the genuine affection between their master and his intended bride, had taken to the change with the pragmatism of those accustomed to the caprices of their employers. More significantly, society had begun the slow process of acceptance that Ronan had predicted. Invitations had continued to arrive, though now they were issued to both of them, and the tone had shifted from curiosity to something approaching genuine welcome. The scandal that had threatened to consume them had, through a combination of Ronan's unwavering support and Elowen's quiet dignity, begun to fade into the background. But it was what had occurred within the private chambers of Ashton Hall that mattered most to her now. Ronan had become, in the span of mere weeks, a devoted father, not the absent, distant figure that propriety might have permitted, but actively engaged in the daily rituals of Alden's care and development. He read to the boy, played with him, spoke to him of his mother, Catherine, with a tenderness that brought tears to Elowen's eyes. And in those quiet moments, when she would find them together, father and son, Elowen began to understand the true measure of redemption. It was not the grand public gestures, impressive as they were. It was the small daily choices to love, to be present, to rebuild what time and grief had nearly destroyed. When Ronan returned with Alden from the garden, his cheeks flushed from cold and exertion, he handed the child to Elowen with obvious reluctance, as though parting from him even for the duration of a nap was an intolerable hardship. "He grows stronger each day," Ronan observed, watching as Elowen began the familiar ritual of removing the child's heavy coat. "Do you notice how his eyes track movement? The physician assures me that such development is entirely normal, yet I cannot help but feel that Alden is exceptional in all things." "All fathers believe their children exceptional," Elowen said with gentle humor. "It is, I believe, a universal condition of the species." "Perhaps," he conceded, settling into the chair by the hearth. Yet I am certain that in Alden's case the belief is justified. As Elowyn settled Alden into his cradle for his afternoon rest, Ronan remained silent, his gaze fixed upon the sleeping child with an intensity that spoke of profound contemplation. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "about the future, about what kind of man I wish Alden to become, and what kind of example I must set to guide him toward that outcome." Elowyn turned from the cradle, her expression inviting him to continue. "I spent years, decades if I'm being honest, believing that strength meant isolation, that power meant dominion over others, that love was a weakness to be suppressed." He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his waistcoat pocket, though it found nothing there. The watch was elsewhere now, displayed openly in the study, marking time as it had failed to do for so long. "I was wrong. I can see that now with a clarity that only a man confronted with his own mortality, or rather, with the mortality of his pride, can achieve." He rose and moved to stand beside Elowyn at the cradle, his gaze still fixed upon the sleeping boy. "I want Alden to learn that true strength lies in the ability to acknowledge error, to face one's failures without flinching, and to have the courage to change. I want him to understand that love, genuine, unprotected, freely given love, is not weakness but the greatest strength a man can possess, and I want him to see, in the example of my marriage to you, that honor is not a frozen thing, but something alive and breathing and capable of transformation." Elowyn felt tears prick her eyes. "You will teach him all of that and more," she said softly, "by being the man you are becoming." "We will teach him," Ronan corrected gently, taking her hand. "Together, as partners, as lovers, as his parents, because whatever mistakes I have made, whatever blindness has clouded my vision in the past, I have learned this much. Redemption is not a solitary journey. It requires the presence of another person, someone courageous enough to see not what we were but what we might become." He raised her hand to his lips, and the gesture, though simple, contained within it all of the devotion, all of the gratitude, all of the transformed love that had emerged from the ashes of his former rage. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, in the quiet nursery where a child slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge of belonging, two people who had nearly destroyed each other stood together, witnessing the beginning of something far more precious than either had dared to imagine. It was not the ending that either of them had expected. It was perhaps far better. It was a beginning. The morning of the wedding arrived with a clarity of light that seemed almost symbolic, as though the heavens themselves were bearing witness to the union that was about to be solemnized. Elowyn stood before the mirror in her chamber, allowing the seamstress to make final adjustments to her gown, a creation of ivory silk and Honiton lace that had required 3 months of meticulous craftsmanship. Yet her mind was not upon the dress, nor upon the elaborate ceremony that awaited her in the chapel of Ashton House. Instead, her thoughts were occupied with the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment, from a woman accused of deception to a woman about to become a duchess, not through conquest or manipulation, but through the redemptive power of truth acknowledged and love actively chosen. A knock upon the door announced the arrival of Lady Ashton, Ronan's sister, whose initial involvement in the concealment of Alden's existence had evolved, over these past months, into a profound alliance with Elowyn. She carried with her a small box of polished rosewood, a gift, Lady Ashton said, pressing it into Elowyn's hands. "From Ronan. He insisted that you receive it before the ceremony, though he made me swear not to reveal its contents until you opened it yourself." Elowyn's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Within, nestled upon velvet the color of twilight, lay 2 items: a letter, sealed with the Valorhurst crest in deep crimson wax, and a miniature portrait painted in oils, a rendering of Catherine, Ronan's late wife, executed with such skill that it seemed to capture not merely her physical features, but something essential of her spirit. "He wishes you to know," Lady Ashton explained gently, "that in choosing you he is not forsaking the memory of Catherine. Rather, he is honoring her legacy by offering to the woman she loved. Yes, she loved you, Elowyn, though she could not speak it aloud, a future filled with the joy and security that Catherine herself was denied." With shaking hands, Elowyn broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was Ronan's, bold, decisive, yet infused with an emotion that seemed to pour from the very ink. "My dearest Elowyn, by the time you read these words, you will understand the truth that has taken me far too long to fully comprehend. Catherine was not merely my wife, She was a woman of extraordinary prescience and courage. In the months before Alden's birth, she wrote to me of her fears, but also of her hopes. She wrote that should she not survive to raise our child, she prayed that a woman of virtue and strength would enter our lives. She wrote your name, Elowen. She wrote that should her worst fears come to pass, she entrusted to you not only the care of our son, but also the task of teaching me what it means to love without fear. I have failed many times in my attempts to comprehend her wisdom, but today, as I prepare to make you my wife before all of society, I understand at last. Catherine did not leave me a burden. She left me a gift. She left me you. Do not grieve for her. Instead, live fully, love deeply, and know that in doing so, you honor the memory of a woman whose love was so vast that it reached beyond the veil of death itself to shape the future. I am the most fortunate of men. Forever yours, Ronan Elowen pressed the letter to her heart, and Lady Ashton drew her into an embrace, offering no words, because words seemed inadequate to the moment. When it came time to proceed to the chapel, Elowen discovered that she no longer felt afraid. The weight of Catherine's blessing, transmitted through Ronan's words and made manifest in the portrait he had commissioned, had transformed her apprehension into something approaching peace. The chapel was filled with guests, yet as she walked down the aisle, it was Ronan's face that held all of her attention. He stood at the altar, resplendent in formal dress, yet his eyes held none of the aristocratic coldness that had once defined his features. Instead, they burned with a warmth that seemed to illuminate the entire space, as though his love itself had become a source of light. When he took her hand, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, a reminder that even a man of his strength and authority could be moved to vulnerability by genuine emotion. The vicar's words seemed to pass as though spoken from a great distance, until the moment when Ronan was asked if he took this woman to be his wife. His response came with such fervent conviction that several guests gasped audibly. "I do," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel, "and I shall spend every day of my remaining life proving myself worthy of her trust." When he kissed her, carefully, reverently, with all of London's elite bearing witness, Elowen felt something fundamental shift within her. She was no longer the accused, the hidden, the woman whose reputation hung by a thread. She was a bride. She was a duchess. She was, perhaps for the first time in her life, entirely, unquestionably home. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and Ashton Hall had become a place transformed by the presence of genuine happiness. Spring had arrived with its promise of renewal, and the gardens where Elowen now stood, watching Ronan and Alden explore the newly awakened blooms, seemed to vibrate with the energy of new life and possibilities. She was with child, their child, and though she had not yet told Ronan, she suspected that his observant nature would soon discover the truth. There was a tenderness in the way he now regarded her, an attentiveness that suggested he was already aware of the subtle changes occurring within her body. The past months had been filled with the ordinary work of becoming a duchess, learning the management of estates, understanding the intricacies of their responsibilities toward their tenants and their position within society. Yet through it all, what struck Elowen most profoundly was the simplicity of their happiness. There were no grand dramas, no sweeping declarations. Instead, there were quiet mornings when Ronan would read to her while she sat with her needlework. There were evenings when they would walk together through the grounds, discussing the future, the changes they wished to make, their hopes for Alden's education and character development. And there were nights when he would hold her, as though she were something infinitely precious, as though the memory of nearly losing her through his own blindness had taught him never to take for granted the gift of her presence. This morning, Ronan entered the garden carrying Alden upon his shoulders, the child shrieking with delight, his small hands tangled in his father's dark hair. The transformation in their relationship had been extraordinary to witness. The man who had come to Ashton Hall consumed by rage had become a father who possessed an almost comical devotion to his son. "There you are," Ronan said, settling Alden upon the grass to explore the flowering plants, whilst he moved to stand beside Elowen. "I have been searching for you. I wish to show you something." He took her hand and guided her toward the gazebo, where a small wooden crate had been placed upon the bench. Inside she discovered it, a pocket watch, its casing crafted of white gold, its face bearing delicate engravings of intertwining roses. "For you," he said, taking her other hand, "so that you might always carry with you a symbol of time moving forward, of hours and moments we share together, of a future that we are actively creating rather than passively enduring." "It is beautiful," Eowyn whispered. "It is nothing compared to what you have given me," Ronan replied. He pressed a kiss to her palm. "You have given me redemption, Eowyn. You have given me a son whom I might have lost forever. You have given me a future I did not deserve, and a love I had convinced myself was impossible. How can any gift I offer compare to that?" Alden, having tired of the flowers, came toddling toward them, his small arms reaching upward in demand to be held. Ronan scooped him up, and Eowyn found herself drawn into an embrace that contained all three of them, father, mother, and child, united in a bond that transcended blood or circumstance. "I have something to tell you," Eowyn said softly, "something I discovered only this morning when I consulted with the physician." Ronan's eyes widened with understanding, even before she spoke the words. "We are to have another child," she said, "in the autumn. A brother or sister for Alden." She watched as profound joy transformed his face, a transformation so complete that it seemed to erase the last remnants of the man he had been, the man consumed by pride and the conviction that love was something to be feared rather than embraced. "Another child," he repeated, wonder clear in his voice. "Our child." "Yes," Eowyn confirmed. "Ours. Born of love, born of trust, born of the redemption that we have found together." He held them both, Alden and Eowyn, and in that moment beneath the flowering trees of the garden at Ashton Hall, the final piece of his transformation was completed. The man who had believed himself irredeemable had been redeemed. The child who had been hidden had been claimed, and the woman who had borne the weight of impossible circumstances had been lifted up and cherished and made whole. Time, which had once seemed to stand still at the moment of his wife's death, had learned to move forward again, and in moving forward, it had carried all of them toward a future more beautiful than any of them had dared to imagine. 5 years had passed since that fateful day when Ronan had arrived at Ashton Hall consumed by rage and the certainty of betrayal. The drawing room where he now sat, surrounded by his expanded family, seemed almost to glow with the contentment that had become the natural state of the household. Eowyn sat across from him. Their son, young Edmund, born in the autumn after their marriage, played contentedly with his wooden toys nearby, whilst Alden, now a sturdy boy of nearly 6 years, engaged in animated conversation with his governess about the breeding habits of rabbits. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught upon the faces of all they held dear, and Ronan found himself momentarily overcome with a sense of gratitude so profound that it rendered him mute. It was Eowyn who broke the silence, moving to sit beside him on the sofa, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "You are thinking," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact born from years of learning to read the nuances of his expressions. "I am thinking," he admitted, "of the man I was, the man who would have cast you out without a second thought, who would have denied his own son, who would have allowed pride to destroy everything that was good and true in his life. That man no longer exists," Eowyn said gently. "He was transformed by love and truth, by the courage of a woman who refused to let him remain in darkness." Ronan turned to look at his wife, and in her eyes he saw reflected not condemnation, but compassion, a compassion born of understanding the pain that had driven his earlier blindness. "I owe you more than I could ever repay," he said, "not merely for Alden, though that alone is a debt beyond measure. I owe you for showing me that a man can change, that pride can be surrendered without destroying one's integrity, that love, true love, requires vulnerability and the willingness to be wrong." "You owe me nothing," Eowyn replied, "except this." She gestured to the contentment that surrounded them, to the family they had built from the ashes of pain and misunderstanding. "This is payment enough. This is redemption made manifest." As evening descended, after the children had been put to bed and the servants had withdrawn to their own quarters, Ronan found himself in the library, standing before the portrait of Catherine that he had commissioned. The painting held pride of place above the mantelpiece, a constant reminder of the wife he had lost and the extraordinary legacy she had left behind. He withdrew a letter from his desk, one of many that Catherine had left behind, to be delivered to him in the event of her death. This one he had saved for last, unable until now to bear the weight of her final words. With trembling hands, he broke the seal and unfolded the paper that bore the handwriting he had loved so dearly. "My dearest Ronan, if you are reading this, then I have departed from this world and you are left to navigate your grief alone. I do not wish this for you. God knows I would change it if I possessed the power to do so. But since I do not, I must ask something of you, something that will require a courage greater than any you have yet demonstrated. I ask you to forgive yourself, I know that you will rage against this loss. I know that you will convince yourself that you are unworthy of happiness, that love is a cruel jest played by an indifferent universe. But this is where you must find your true strength, not in isolation, not in the hardening of your heart against further pain, but in the opening of yourself to the possibility of redemption. There is a woman, or perhaps there will be by the time you read this, a woman of virtue and courage and quiet strength. Elowen is her name. She will come into your life bearing the greatest gift I could offer you, our child alive and well, and a love that will transform you if you allow it. Do not reject this gift, my love. Do not turn away from the possibility of redemption because you believe yourself unworthy. Accept it with gratitude and humility. Build with this woman a life filled with joy and purpose, and know that in doing so, you honor not only my memory, but the extraordinary gift of a second chance. Live, Ronan. Truly live. Let love remake you. Forever yours, across the veil of death itself, Catherine. When Elowen found him some time later, tears were streaming down his face. Not the tears of a man consumed by grief, but the tears of a man who had finally, fully understood the magnitude of the love that had been offered to him, both in life and in the provision made for his future. She asked no questions, merely sat beside him and held his hand, understanding that some grief must be felt in silence, and some gratitude can only be expressed through the presence of another person who loves us fully and without reservation. In the years that followed, Ronan became known throughout England not merely as a man of power and authority, but as a man of unusual compassion and wisdom. He established charitable institutions for women in difficult circumstances, protecting them from the judgments of society and offering them pathways toward independence and dignity. He became an advocate for the reform of marriage laws, arguing passionately that women deserved legal protections and the right to agency within their unions. And in his private life, he became the man that Catherine had envisioned, a man transformed by love, redeemed by truth, and devoted entirely to the well-being and happiness of those entrusted to his care. Elowen bore him 3 more children, each one a testament to the love that had been forged from the crucible of misunderstanding and pain. And when Alden came of age, he proved to be a man of remarkable character, inheriting from his father a capacity for change, and from his mother a quiet courage that allowed him to navigate the complexities of both privilege and responsibility with grace and integrity. The watch that Ronan had given Elowen on their wedding day became a family heirloom, passed down through generations as a symbol of time moving forward, of lives transformed by the willingness to believe in redemption, and of the extraordinary power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. In the end, the greatest victory was not the public vindication of Elowen's character, nor the acknowledgement of Alden's legitimacy, impressive as those achievements were. The greatest victory was the quiet one, achieved in the private chambers and gardens of Ashton Hall, the victory of a man learning to forgive himself, a woman learning to trust in her own worth, and a child learning that love, in all of its forms, was the truest inheritance any person could receive. The silence that had once been a barrier between them became at last a testament to the depth of their understanding, a silence that needed no words because it was filled entirely with the presence of love, fully acknowledged, freely given, and eternally cherished. In the grand tapestry of human experience, there exists a truth that we often forget in our haste to judge and condemn. Every silence conceals a story, and every story contains the possibility of redemption. This tale of Ronan and Elowen teaches us something profound about the nature of pride, forgiveness, and the transformative power of love. Ronan's journey, from a man consumed by rage and the certainty of betrayal to a man capable of extraordinary compassion, reminds us that our worst moments do not define us. What defines us is what we do when confronted with the truth of our own blindness. Do we retreat further into certainty, or do we open ourselves to the possibility of change? Do we cling to the fortress of pride we have built, or do we risk the vulnerability that comes with admitting error? Elowen's courage, her willingness to bear the weight of truth in silence, to maintain her dignity in the face of condemnation, and to believe in the capacity of another person to change, speaks to the strength that exists not in loudness, but in quiet, unwavering conviction. She did not fight with words or accusations. Instead, she allowed her character to speak for itself, trusting that truth, when finally revealed, would be more powerful than any argument she might have constructed. The child, Alden, stands as a symbol of innocence that transcends the complications and conflicts of adults. His eyes, those eyes that so resembled his father's, became the instrument through which pride was finally humbled and love was allowed to flourish. In him, we see the possibility of new beginnings, of futures unmarred by the mistakes of the past. But perhaps the deepest moral of this story lies in the understanding that redemption is not something that happens to us. It is something we must actively choose, moment by moment, day by day. It requires the willingness to be wrong, the courage to change, and the grace to accept that we are all, in the end, fallible creatures doing our best to navigate the complexities of the human heart. In our own lives, we all play the role of Ronan at times, blind to truths we refuse to see, certain in convictions that turn out to be false. And we all have it within us to become the man he became, a man willing to acknowledge error, to grieve what was lost, and to embrace the possibility of a future different from what we had imagined. The silence that falls at the end of this story is not the silence of defeat or resignation. It is the silence of a heart finally at peace, of truth fully acknowledged, and of love finally fully allowed to exist in all of its transformative power. May we all find within ourselves the courage of Elowen and the willingness to change of Ronan. May we all learn to listen not just with our ears but with our hearts. And may we all understand that the greatest redemption is not the public vindication, but the private transformation that allows us to love and be loved more fully, more deeply, and more authentically than we ever thought possible. Dear beloved listener, if this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of the power of truth to transform, of love to heal, of redemption to remake us, we invite you to join our growing community of Victorian romance enthusiasts. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss a single story of passion, honor, and the triumph of love over adversity. Each week we bring you new tales from the world of Victorian romance, stories that celebrate the complexity of human emotion and the extraordinary potential for change that exists within every heart. Leave a comment below and tell us, what moment in Ronan and Elowen's story resonated most deeply with you? How has this tale of redemption and transformation touched your own understanding of forgiveness and love? Your voice matters to us, and we cherish the community that has built itself around these timeless narratives of the heart. Share this story with those you love, particularly with anyone in your life who might benefit from being reminded that change is always possible, that love is worth the risk, and that redemption awaits those brave enough to seek it. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the drawing rooms and gardens of Victorian England, where pride is humbled, truth is revealed, and love, in all of its extraordinary complexity, ultimately triumphs. On behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we extend our deepest gratitude to you for the time you have devoted to listening to Ronan and Elowen's remarkable journey. Your presence with us in this intimate space, where stories are told and hearts are moved, is a gift we do not take lightly. We believe in the transformative power of story. We believe that in hearing the struggles, triumphs, and transformations of characters who learn to love more fully and live more courageously, we are reminded of these same possibilities within our own lives. Thank you for allowing us to be part of your journey. Thank you for your loyalty, your engagement, and your willingness to venture once more into the world of Victorian romance. We look forward to welcoming you back very soon for another tale of passion, redemption, and the enduring power of love. Until next time, may you find within yourselves the wisdom of Elowen, the capacity for change of Ronan, and the innocent hope of Alden. May you embrace the possibilities that life offers, may you forgive yourselves and others with grace, and may you never underestimate the transformative power of genuine love. With deepest affection and gratitude, Victorian Romance, audio stories where every heart finds its home in the timeless elegance of love.